Last September, Chevy announced the new Monte Carlo. Now we'd like to announce that you can buy one. For the first time, Chevy is in a position to match the strong initial demand for it.
Back in 1970, Chevrolet introduced their first personal luxury car, the Monte Carlo. Sharing much of its design with the Pontiac Grand Prix, the Monte Carlo wasn't initially intended to be a sports car. Its creation late in the muscle car era gave its rear-drive V8 little time to earn much street cred before the gas crisis choked much of its performance potential. However, its size and shape also made it a perfect fit for NASCAR.
If this gets any more exciting, they're going to have to tow me out of the booth!
After a short rebranding as the Lumina coupe, the Monte Carlo would return in 1995, but only with a front-drive V6. And despite a significant attempt at rebranding as a sports car by the year 2000, low sales finally killed it for good in 2007. This is the story of the Chevrolet Monte Carlo. This is my old car.
Want to be like the Earnhardt? Drive the all-new Chevy Monte Carlo. The cars more champions depend on.
I can fix those shocks!
With over 4.4 million sold over a 37-year period, the Monte Carlo was one of Chevy's best-selling cars in its history. Despite these big sales numbers and its strong connection to NASCAR, the Monte Carlo was in an ever-decreasing market for big coupes, which led Chevy to try rebranding it as a Lumina coupe in 1990.
Introducing Lumina, the adult sport coupe.
Only to realize the error of their ways and rename it back to Monte Carlo in 1995. Its original existence was to give Chevy a decent competitor to the Ford Thunderbird, and the Monte Carlo would eventually outlast its chief rival, or at least the big two-door coupe T-Bird. In the late 60s, the Chevelle was the affordable muscle car for Chevy, and the Camaro joined it in 1967 as Chevy's pony car. But what Chevy didn't have was a personal luxury coupe, a body style that is extinct today, but would become increasingly popular in the 70s, thanks to this very car.
What do you drive?
An Esteem.
A what?
A Suzuki Esteem. It's an import.
With Pontiac launching the third-gen Grand Prix in 1969 on the rear-drive G-body platform, Pete Estes, then general manager of Chevrolet, conceived the Monte Carlo as a Chevy alternative to the Buick Riviera and Oldsmobile Toronado. Although during its development, it wasn't called the Monte Carlo, but instead was the Concours, to align with the plan to be more luxury-oriented. By the time the Monte Carlo was officially introduced in September of 1969, former Pontiac chief John Z. DeLorean took the honors with the reveal, as by then DeLorean had replaced Estes as general manager of Chevrolet. Like the Grand Prix, the Monte Carlo was on GM's G-body platform, only available as a hardtop coupe, and was about 9 inches longer than the A-body Chevelle. Unlike the Chevelle, which in 1970 came standard with a V6 that only made 155 horsepower, the Monte Carlo's base engine was a 350 cubic inch 5.7 liter V8 that was rated at 250 horsepower.
Monte Carlo.
But I found it. See?
Imported car.
It's a Chevrolet! It's a Chevrolet!
The Monte Carlo did share the Chevelle's dashboard design, but the Monte Carlo leaned more towards luxury, with a simulated wood veneer that was intended to look like the real elm wood used by Rolls-Royce at the time. Monte Carlos could be had with power steering, windows and seats, and air conditioning, plus other luxury-themed options that could bring its price to over $5,000, or around $38,000 today.
Monte Carlo, much like a sports car, but with the handsome appointments you look for in a personal luxury car.
For $420 extra, you could get the Super Sport, or SS trim. The SS offered the largest engine, a 454 cubic inch 7.4 liter V8, rated at 360 horsepower. But since Chevrolet marketed the Monte Carlo as a luxury car, few buyers were interested, with less than 4,000 sold for the 1970 model year. With only around 1,900 SS 454s sold for 1971, it was dropped for 1972, although the engine itself continued as an option until 1975. Despite the early Monte Carlo SS's being a sales disappointment, in 1971, the Monte Carlo was a perfect fit for NASCAR, as the size just met the length requirements, and the Chevy dealer network offered easy access to parts, not to mention that Ford and Chrysler had recently ended their backing for motorsports. So although Chevrolet had intended the Monte Carlo to be a luxury car, NASCAR fans knew the name for a purpose that was about as far from luxury as one could get. The first-gen Monte Carlo only lasted 3 years, as GM was revamping its entire midsize lineup for 1973. Although 1973 was also the start of the oil embargo, which resulted in the worst gas crisis the US had ever faced. The second-gen Monte Carlo gained 6 inches in length, although some of that extra length was because of new 5-mile-per-hour bumpers.
Set up the roadblock.
This generation featured arguably its most in-your-face styling for its entire run, with prominent front and rear fenders that made it visually far different from the related Grand Prix. It also switched from a hardtop to what GM called a colonnade top, with fixed opera windows between the B and C pillars, and new swiveling front bucket seats. With industry standards changing the horsepower ratings from gross to net, the power numbers dropped significantly from the previous generation, with a 350 cubic inch V8 now only officially making 145 horsepower.
You have insurance?
Motor Trend awarded the Monte Carlo its Car of the Year for 1973, and with nearly 250,000 sold, it set a new sales record for Chevrolet. Despite the oil embargo hurting sales for big cars, somehow the Monte Carlo bucked that trend, with a new record of 300,000 sold for 1974, and only a drop to 250,000 for 1975. The 1976 models had a refreshening of the front and rear, with dual round headlights changed to quad stacked rectangular headlights.
Well, how about food, son? You bring enough food? Plenty.
Not surprisingly, the biggest 454 V8 was dropped as an option, and the base engine was a smaller 305 cubic inch 5-liter V8. The final year for the second gen, 1977, was a unique year for Chevrolet, as its largest model, the B-body Caprice, was shrunk as part of a corporate downsizing, which made it smaller than the mid-size Monte Carlo, but only for that year, as the Monte Carlo joined the downsizing for its third gen in 1978. The third gen, now in a new smaller G-body, was a foot shorter and over 700 pounds lighter than the second gen, and yet somehow had increased interior and trunk space. It also still had a similar fender design as before, although it arguably didn't look as good on the shortened G-body. But it allowed the Monte Carlo to keep its own unique look across 3 models that now shared the G-body, not just the Grand Prix as before, but now also the Buick Regal and Oldsmobile Cutlass Supreme.
So where's the office back at Division? In the office, baby.
The 1978 model changed out the stacked quad rectangular headlights back to dual, but changed again in 1980 to quad rectangular headlights now oriented horizontally instead of vertically. V6 engines were now standard, or an optional Buick Turbo V6 starting in 1980, and after 1979, manual transmissions were no longer offered due to so few buyers opting for them. The fourth generation, which began in 1981, is a bit confusing in regard to GM body designations. For 1981, the 4th Gen Monte Carlo was now on a new rear-drive A-body, but only for 1981. Starting in 1982, GM renamed the A-body to G, as the A-body became the new smaller front-drive models, like the Chevy Celebrity. Although the same basic platform as the 3rd Gen, the 4th Gen followed the trend of the early 80s.
Oh my God, Julian, is this your car?
Yep.
Monte Carlo, what a cool car.
Becoming more boxy, but just up front, as the rear profile still kept some of the trademark curves that made it more recognizable as a Monte Carlo.
I'm guessing this one doesn't bounce.
NASCAR was still using Monte Carlos during this period, but they weren't nearly as successful as they had been in the 70s. For 1983, Chevrolet finally reintroduced the SS model for the Monte Carlo, and you couldn't miss it thanks to a new front and rear end that ditched the chrome for a blacked-out grille, color-matched bumpers, and an integrated rear spoiler. The 5-liter V8 that had last been in the Monte Carlo 12 years earlier was finally back, although now only making 175 horsepower. With big SS decals on the doors, this is the model I remember best as a kid growing up in the 80s, and as such, I've always thought of this one as the best looking of all the generations. Unlike the original SS from the 1st Gen, this new SS was far more popular, so much so that although overall Monte Carlo sales dropped from 1984 to 85, the number of SS models sold increased from 24,000 to over 35,000, despite the horsepower for the SS only increasing to 180. For 1986, 200 units were designated as Aero Coupes, with the rear window redesigned to match the more aerodynamic window shape required for the NASCAR models. Only 200 were required to satisfy the homologation rules and allow the Monte Carlo to continue to be used for NASCAR. The revised window made the trunk lid about half as long as it was before, and was admittedly a bit odd looking, enough so that it almost made it onto my Weird GM Cars episode. But apparently it wasn't too odd, as over 6,000 more Aero Coupes were sold for 1987. Despite over 112,000 Monte Carlos sold for 1987, Chevrolet had new plans for the nameplate. Although there was a 1988 model, it was cut short to only 30,000 sold, as its replacement, the front-wheel drive Lumina, was slated to arrive in 1989 for the 1990 model year. The Lumina was offered in both coupe and sedan, so the coupe replaced the Monte Carlo, and the sedan replaced the Celebrity. Chevy offered the Lumina Z34 to be the replacement for the Monte Carlo SS. The Z34 could only be had with the V6, no more V8, although ironically, the V6 had higher horsepower than the Monte Carlo SS had at its end in 1988. Despite the Z34's horsepower rating, sales were nowhere near what the Monte Carlo SS once had. In a sign of desperation, when the Lumina was redesigned for its second generation in 1995, the coupe version of the Lumina was renamed back to the Monte Carlo. The only problem was, it still looked like a two-door version of the Lumina, which was about as bland as a car could get back then.
Mr. Freeman.
How are you?
Tommy?
Monte Carlo loyalists hated it, considering it was front-wheel drive and looked nothing like it once did. The SS also didn't return for the 5th generation. Instead, Chevy kept the Z34 designation once used on the Lumina. Over its 5-year run, sales were less than half each year of what the old model had gotten even near its end in the late 80s. Considering that all mid-size coupes were dropping in popularity in the late 90s, the fact that the Monte Carlo didn't just end in '99 is quite surprising. Instead, Chevy offered a 6th gen for 2000 with an all-new body and a definitely more sporty look, but sadly it still had front-wheel drive.
The sleek, new 200 horsepower Chevy Monte Carlo SS.
Hot.
The Lumina sedan was also replaced with a legacy name, the Impala, although that one was a sad replacement for what used to carry the Impala name. The 6th gen Monte Carlo invoked some of the styling of old, with sheet metal creases above the wheels to simulate the big fenders it once had. The 6th gen Monte Carlo's look had been foreshadowed by the Intimidator concept car that was revealed in 1997, and the design was still a homologation to allow for its likeness in NASCAR. The SS model returned, but with only a 3.8-liter V6, and a supercharger was added in 2004. But with all the power going to the front wheels, it definitely had its critics. However, Chevrolet offered several pace car editions from 2000 to 2003, as well as a special Intimidator model in 2002, honoring the Monte Carlo's most famous driver, Dale Earnhardt, who tragically passed away on the track in 2001. There were also collector models made for Jeff Gordon, Dale Earnhardt Jr., and Tony Stewart. With sales averaging around 70,000 per year, it was still nowhere close to what the old rear-drive V8 models once had, but still an improvement over the Lumina-based 5th gen. A refresh came in 2006, with new headlamps, and finally a V8 brought back for the SS, a 5.3-liter LS4 that made just over 300 horsepower. Less than 15,000 SS models were sold in 2006 and 2007, the latter accounting for more than half of all Monte Carlo sales that year. General Motors' overall sales were on the downswing, and the market crash of 2008 led to GM's bankruptcy, so no surprise that the Monte Carlo was sacrificed. But following their bailout, instead of resurrecting the Monte Carlo name, they instead decided to resurrect the Camaro for 2010, which had last sold in 2002. The Camaro is another name that is going away in 2024, leaving the Corvette as GM's last sport coupe, a market that, just like the personal luxury coupe that the Monte Carlo once helped be so popular, will likely never again return to its former glory. Thanks for watching.
No, we just want some gas, muchacho.
If you like this video, click the like button and subscribe to my channel.
Hey, Turk, we got a credit card in there? Huh? Credit card.
If you once owned a car from the 80s to mid-2000s that you rarely see today and would like it featured in a future episode, leave a reply in the comments or contact me at the email shown here. See you next time.
You want to fill up, Mrs. Nussbaum?